We're about 2 weeks, about 17 days away from the kickoff of campaigns officially for the 2023 general elections. A lot of the candidates have been making silent or covert moves in the last couple of weeks and months, but from the 28th of September, everything will be let open. We'll see the results of all the conversations that have been held. The PDP is still in their quagmire with regards to the chairman of the party being asked to step down by certain members of the party. The APC continues to convince Nigerians that choosing two candidates regardless of religion or tribe is the perfect sell. The Labour Party continues to have the structure question being thrown at them, and of course all the other candidates in the race. But elections, of course, are beyond just the presidential candidates. We have other levels of government running for office, and certain issues will continue to be a hot topic. The economy is very big on many people's minds at the moment, and we did hear from the Minister of Finance saying about 11 trillion naira, that's a T, will be borrowed to sort of fund the 2023 fiscal budget for Nigeria. We're already in a borrowing mess by a lot of standards, and Nigerians are wondering where that leaves the incoming government from May next year, if they're going to be thrown into what is a deep hole of debt. I have a special guest here with me who's a financial consultant to help us understand what the year ahead holds for Nigerians. Jonathan Ikeolumba is here with me. Thanks for being here today.
Yeah, I think it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Help us understand where we are at the moment. A lot of Nigerians basically understand what they feel on the streets. We understand that everything is completely out of reach now. Basic things, food, clothing, there's almost no disposable income for anybody anymore. Let's not even go into the conversation of what's happening with the Naira. So these are what Nigerians see. But the government continues to talk about, borrowing even more. What does that mean for me, for the guy on the street, for the average Nigerian who is already in the fix?
Okay, I think this is a very interesting question you've asked, but let me share some perspectives. So this is our 7th year running a deficit budget, which essentially means that the amount of revenues you can generate is quite lower than what we need to spend. And if you compare Nigeria with a couple of African economies like South Africa, like Kenya, like even Ghana, the expenditure per capita, which really refers to how much expenditure can go to one individual, is actually quite very low, even with the fact that we have this deficit that we need in terms of financing the budget. So I think it's quite apt when you say how much of a problem is this? Does this look like a chaos? I think that there are quite a lot of positives when you look at funding a budget through borrowings, which is why we have a lot of deficit. But it remains, I think the bigger question is, how essentially will the funds be utilized? I think to the extent that, we see the funding going to the right places, then we can begin to see the trickle-down effect of some of these things on the average Nigerian on the street.
I think that's also a very fundamental point, because government continues to tout its infrastructure drive. We're hearing about train stations being opened everywhere, train tracks are opening, bridges have been built, airports are probably being commissioned. Is that supposed to have some sort of long-term effect on the Nigerian? Because people don't seem to be able to relate that to what's happening with their pockets. And we might see more of that in the coming budgets, where infrastructure there's a heavy spend on that. Is that what Nigerians need?
So really to restructure the economy in terms of generate the potentials that the economy really can achieve, I think the easiest way to look at it is infrastructure drives the foundation of economic stimulation. And when there's infrastructure, you're able to attract investments, right? So for example, if you think around how people can move about with goods and services, I think it's really down to infrastructure. Also, if you think about how to attract customers in a diverse nation like this, I think some of this infrastructure you've listed really is very critical, very fundamental. And let's be clear about this, that many investors really somewhat look at the direction of our investment in infrastructure as a sign to what's in it for them when they think about the operating cost of running a business in Nigeria. So they think about our infrastructural development, how easy is it to be able to attract the potentials that this market has. And infrastructure really, it's a picture to just somewhat show what is in it for them really.
Yeah. I want to talk subsidies now, because that's a very big problem. And it looks like government is caught between the devil and the deep blue sea. You take away subsidies, it affects Nigerians even more, because we know what's going to happen with pricing. And if subsidy on fuel, on education, there's a lot of things are subsidized by government. And government is starting to talk about the fact that we need to stop this to be able to focus on what our job really is. The petroleum products conversation seems almost inevitable at this point because we're hearing figures around 6 trillion being allocated to just subsidies alone. Education you can have an argument for and things like that. What's the future on that, you think? How does this affect an incoming government that might be faced with the fact that they have to now do this, especially at the start of their administration?
Okay, so I think that's a double-edged question you've asked. So the first one is around, the role of subsidies and, the devil around, subsidies as a recurring pattern in our budget. So actually for this budget, there are two scenarios, right? So scenario one is where we look at, the budget being business as usual. We're going to have, petroleum subsidy, go on for a full year. And that's pegged at 6.62 trillion, right, for petroleum subsidy. There's also another scenario, which is, to just have it till the end of this government. So if I would say, for 6 months, into 2023, and that should come to us something around 3.32 trillion. The real argument is, so there's the case for subsidy. There are conversations around where should the subsidy go into, right? I like the fact that you've spoken about education as an area we can look at subsidizing. Interestingly, the vice president was in America sometimes last week, and there was a commitment from the World Bank to say, look, we would support you as Nigeria in terms of, eliminating subsidy you carry for petroleum, and actually would help by protecting the vulnerables, which is really subsidizing, people in terms of their lifestyle, especially the most vulnerable, the lowly placed in the society. So I think that if you really ask me, it seems to me really like there's a political element to that conversation around having the petroleum, subsidy, the removal. Yes, there's the Petroleum Industry Act, which really was somewhat supposed to be like a signpost to looking at, subsidies eventually being phased out. But the reality is this really the right time? That's my sense, when I look at the amount of energy going into should subsidy be removed on petroleum as at now. But I think we need subsidy. Should it be petroleum subsidy? I don't know. I like the arguments around subsidizing education, given what is happening now with ASU. But I think what it really appears to me is we might see subsidy for the first 6 months. That's for me what I think is more realistic.
Yeah, I think the Minister of Finance said about June 2023,
so,
which is when the new government is in.
So that's why I said you can't divulge away, politics from this sort of conversation. But I think we might see for the first 6 months, and then I think the new government who will come in will be in a very big position to determine what will be the future of subsidy on petroleum.
I've heard a lot of numbers being bandied. I think one that stuck with me was about 500 naira or so to a litre of fuel if the subsidy goes away. What does that mean for me and you if we have to buy fuel for 500 naira plus for a litre? What does that mean for the price of food, for just everything?
Okay, so the argument is that's the real price, right? So maybe 400 to 500. The argument is that's the real price. And so we are subsidizing that price currently. Now, so are we feeling the effects, in terms of, has that made the lives of people a lot easier since then? So the argument is if we take away the subsidy on petroleum and let people pay the real price and then fund, directly. So for example, if you think about things like, education like we've been speaking about, or even social amenities, maybe subsidizing transport, or subsidizing means of, access to even getting basic finance. I think the argument is the real price is around 400 to 500, but are we feeling the impact? So do we change the direction of how we look at subsidy? And so if we say fuel price should come into something like 400 to 500, and then we're able to fund people directly, especially the most vulnerable, for me, that's really where I see the biggest impact. Are we going to have a different sense of how much this will be in terms of even things like inflation? So is it working for us? I don't know. Currently, with the subsidy going on, so fuel is currently anything around 160 to 180. Is it really working? So would there be a difference if we decide to say, let's fund people's lifestyles directly, or fund critical areas that affect the poor, and then, allow the natural price just take effect? But bear in mind that, across African countries as well, too, I think the price you've just quoted, and if you look at the exchange rate difference, I think that's really the kind of price you see across Africa, really.
I want to talk about, our fiscal year generally.
Yeah.
There's been an argument about, an outgoing government imposing a budget on a new administration. People have argued about the fact that maybe we should have a financial year that starts around July. So that the government is in May, you have a month or two, and then you can. Do you think that makes sense? Do you think, what happens now? Because we have a budget usually where there's a good year, we have 50% implementation, which is an overreach. on many levels.
Yeah.
And then now you have a government that's going to pass a budget in December and be out in May on a new government that's supposed to start in May.
Yeah.
Do you think we should start thinking about, is that a valid conversation to have, if that changes anything?
Interestingly, this change to the fiscal year of January to December is quite recent. In fact, it started about the last 3 to 4 years that we had this change in fiscal year. So there are benefits with aligning the budget year to the fiscal year. It helps to even look at how planning should go. I think for me, the way I look at the conversation around should there be a switch for a new government will be to even ask ourselves, have we performed really in past years? You said 50%. Actually, 50% is on the revenue side, right?
Actually.
On the expenditure side, we are doing about 90%. So we really have been doing well in terms of how we spend, but it's on the revenue side. I think that, to be honest, the conversation should be about strong financial controls, just ensuring that, the budget works, ensuring that there's a lot of accountability, on the part of people who should, because for all intent and purpose, I think the idea around, aligning the budget to fiscal year makes sense, for planning purposes. But if the financial controls are very strong, if people do what they should do rightly, there's a lot I know that is happening. For example, the ICPC, the budget office, is working together with the heads of the ministries, the departments and agencies to just ensure budget implementation is happening. I think if we can achieve that, then at least we might have this conversation much fairly. I think so. But for me, it's let's strengthen the controls around how we spend money as a country, also how we also generate revenue vis-a-vis targets. I think that area is really poor. Just achieving the targets on revenue is really poor. I know that not too long ago, there were threats of sanctions on ministries, departments, and agencies that were not going to meet their targets. So I think, for me, that's more like the immediate thing. Let's just ensure that the budgets are working, are performing, targets are being met. Then we can have the conversation on, should we switch, And so let's see how that works.
What does inflation look to you like in the coming months? And the Naira, which is untouchable at this point. What are your thoughts on where we're headed with that?
So the projections, even for the budget, is something around 17 to 18%.
Which is a lot, but...
I wanted to say that that is quite very high. And it affects the concept of what we call in finance the real growth rate, because the real rate really is when you take away the impact on inflation or you discount the impact on inflation. I think that inflation would speak to, how we look at, the way we can generate quite a couple of resources, because it affects earning power, like you said, it affects the power of your disposable income. The reality is what it is, that inflation is quite high, is that, in fact, the last 3 to 4 years has been at double digits, and there's no good news. In fact, even the projection for the next 3 years, because there's a document called the Medium-Term Expenditure Framework, still puts inflation, somewhere around 17 to 18%, even up to 2025. I think that's what we have to deal with. I just think that, let's focus on revitalizing the economy, our revenue, and then we might then look at how we deal with inflation head-on.
On a final note, as quickly as you can, looking at the 2023 budget, are you hopeful?
I think there are quite a lot of ways I can look at it, and maybe that's where the conversation on hope can come in. One of the things that came out strongly with the 2023 proposal plans, as I'll call them now, is that there won't be any new projects. The government doesn't want to focus on new projects. They want to ensure that all existing projects are going to be completed. There are exciting projects I'm aware of that's happening around infrastructure. If the government will stick to ensuring that all those projects achieve completion, just maybe it might be nice. And because this is a transition year, really, I think that there will be a lot of focus on completing what's already happening. And then we can then ask ourselves, is this a budget we should be hopeful about? But I do know that in terms of even revenue projection, we are slightly projecting something lower, around 17% lower than what we had for last year. I think we just have to be optimistic. That's how I look at it.
Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be watching government very closely in spite of all the political distractions that are inevitable. We'll take a break and be back. Please stay with us. Don't just stand there teasing me. Now it's time to show